If God is just, then why give the eternal punishment of hell for temporal sin?
Thank you.
Glad we could do your question.
Thank you for that question. It's a really, really good one, and not just the question about hell, but that idea of eternal punishment for temporal sin. I see that distinction in your question, and it makes it a harder question, and I appreciate that. Let me start off, if it's all right, because I can continue on from what I was saying. I think sometimes we vastly underestimate our sin and its consequences in this life. You know, sometimes when I try to explain the idea of sin to people, they want to say to me, well, really, you're exaggerating. You're not too bad. It's not like you've killed anyone. Well, I just told you that story of the guy from my childhood who went on to commit suicide. So if you ask me that question, have I killed anyone, that's actually a much more difficult question for me to answer than you might think it is. And then what are the consequences of the way I use my free will in his life, him taking his life? What did that do in the context of his family? What will that do in the context of the future generations to come? It's sobering to think about that. You know, sometimes I can look back on my life as a teenager right now and say, man, I thought at the time that was no big deal, but the reality was that was truly terrible. Well, any progress I have made in life, it's about that much. Imagine how far along this path God would be. Imagine if the standard is not someone you see on the 6 o'clock news who has done something worse than you so you can feel better about yourself. What if the standard is a perfectly holy God? A perfectly holy God who loves each one of us. What would our sin look like from his perspective? And the multiplying and the exponential effects of that sin. Maybe Jesus gives us an idea in some of his statements that lust would look like adultery, that unjust anger would look like murder. So temporal sin, eternal punishment, when I think about the reality of my sin, I don't see the gap the way you might initially presume that it is there. But now let's talk just briefly about this idea of hell itself. How are we to understand this idea? I think one of the best ways to understand it is in a relational framework. Jesus invites us into relationship with himself. A relationship can only be entered into if both people say yes to that relationship. If we are not willing to say yes to that relationship, then there's nothing that Jesus can do on his side. Sometimes people say, why is Jesus the only way to heaven? And I answer, well, because Jesus is heaven. That's what heaven is. Why is Jesus the only way to eternal life? Well, because Jesus is eternal life. Flourishing relationship with the God who created you and desires to be in friendship and relationship with you more than anything. That's what eternal life is. It's not just some theme park that we get a ticket to and then we can go or decide not to go. It is the relationship itself. And that's why someone like Christopher Hitchens said, heaven would be hell for me. Why? Because he doesn't want to be with God. Because he said that explicitly at one point in his life. People like Friedrich Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, Thomas Nagel, the philosopher, they say, I don't want to be with God. It would be an invasion of my privacy. It would take away my autonomy. That's not attractive to me. Well, if that's not attractive to you, then God is not going to force you to be with him. And being apart from him in the context of eternity, that's what we call hell. It's interesting that the Bible uses a phrase when it refers to hell at times. It talks about weeping and gnashing of teeth. That may seem like a very harsh phrase to you, and it always did to me as well. But in my family, we've dealt with a lot of estrangement. At one time, 2 uncles of mine, they didn't speak for about 7 years. But I have a vivid memory of the 2 of them being at a wedding together. They both had to be at this wedding. They had to be in each other's physical presence and yet relationally estranged. And you know what I saw on their faces? Literally weeping and gnashing of teeth. That is the natural reaction to being in the presence of someone who you know full well you're supposed to be family with, the person who is supposed to love you most, the person you were intended to be in the deepest friendship with, and knowing that there's nothing other than your own stubbornness that keeps you from being together with them. That all it would have taken on either side, just one of my uncles, to say, I'm sorry, will you forgive me? and that relationship would have been restored. And it is the same with God. He will not force that upon us, but if we will just say, I'm sorry, there is nothing he desires more deeply than relationship with each one.